U.S. at war. San Francisco, December 7th. President Roosevelt announced this morning that Japanese planes had attacked Manila and Pearl Harbor. April 9th. Bataan falls to overwhelming Japanese horror. Two-man subs used a mother vessel. The fact that the men operating these tiny vessels are prepared for self-destruction if necessary was...
Hortense McKay was a strong, independent, and caring woman. From a young age, she fostered concern and attentiveness for her family and her community around Harmony, Minnesota, and as a young adult, she went on to become a nurse. Receiving her nursing degree from the University of Minnesota, she later transferred into the U.S. Army Nurses Corps from the United States Public Health Service. During her time serving in the U.S. military, Lieutenant Colonel McKay endured several of the most difficult experiences a human being could, as she nursed the casualties of battles in the Pacific theater of World War II. As a nurse, she was stationed in various locations overseas. She worked in Corregidor, in the Malinta Tunnel Hospital, throughout Australia, in New Guinea, and most notably in the jungles of Bataan and Leyte. As a nurse, she treated patients after long days of bombings and violence from enemy forces, and she was witness to the flood of casualties into the many hospitals she was stationed at throughout her service. Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay lived through starvation, heat, stress, and war. Yet as she recalled her experiences in Jungle Angel, Bataan Remembered, written by Maxine Kaiser Russell, the friends, laughter, love, and beauty are what McKay remembered more than anything else. Most notably, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay was deployed into the jungles of Bataan to work at one of 2 field hospitals in the area. This tour is described in vivid detail throughout Jungle Angel. The endless, crowded patients slept under the stars, and they suffered in the unprotected, sweltering heat of the sun. The heat and moisture made preserving supplies incredibly difficult, as mold was fast to grow on anything and everything. The bugs were insistent and created a plethora of problems in and of themselves. The patients and nurses alike survived on a starvation diet, all eating from a 12-quart bucket filled with Bataan stew, a mixture of any meat the nurses could find. Horse, fish, monkey, mule, water buffalo, and rice were all present in the stew. Hortense McKay dropped from 115 pounds down to 88 pounds during that time. The bucket was always covered by nets in order to stave off the bugs carrying salmonella, streptococci, and other pathogens that would be deadly to those already weak from a lack of nutrition. Drinkable water was also in short supply, as everyone drank from a few liter bags of water. The state of the patients was tragic, suffering from sickness and injuries from the devastating wartime battles. The only reprieve from the tragedy and horror of the jungle hospital was a nearby stream where the nurses and soldiers could bathe and wash their clothes. Eventually, McKay received orders that she and all of the other nurses were to be evacuated out of Bataan. Not all of those set to evacuate made it to safety. Plagued by sickness and weeks of starvation and heat, the nurses were unsure if they could make it through the jungle. Even so, a frightening and eerie passage through the night on the crowded road through the jungle took Hortense McKay to safety. Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay escaped out of Bataan at 8:30 p.m. on April 8, 1942, just a few hours shy of the fall of Bataan and the beginning of the Bataan Death March. Following her initial evacuation from Bataan, she was moved on and off the peninsula several times, eventually arriving back on Corregidor, only to narrowly avoid capture and escape once more, this time by submarine. The USS Spearfish delivered McKay from the grips of death again and onward towards a continued life of devotion to helping others. While on board the USS Spearfish, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay and the 26 other passengers were crammed together like sardines in a can as they made their way through enemy waters for several weeks. Life aboard the submarine was cramped, hot, and dreary, but the women had a certain effect on the mood, described by one of the submarine's crew members in a poem given to Hortense McKay when they eventually arrived at Perth, Australia.
Beyond a doubt, you'll surely note, if you walk about, a change in the boat. Swedes drinking coffee, beasts turn to tea. Pushover keeps buffing up, as pretty as can be. Scanlon smoking cigarettes, Petey's washing clothes, and even our dear yeoman stopped picking his nose. Joey's up and about, all his time off watch, hanging around the mess hall, playing the music box. I'm trying to say in all these verses, we brought aboard some pretty nurses on that eventful day in May when we were out Corregidor way.
Throughout the war, the nurses and women had a similar effect on everyone around them as described in the poem given to Hortense McKay, lightening moods and finding value in small, beautiful moments, such as stargazing when the skies were clear, or finding personal expression through clothing and beauty trends. From her time on the submarine, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay worked in several locations throughout Australia assigned to dealing with military uniform distribution. The clothing for female nurses in the military was scarce, with new replacements few and far between. The uniform policy was also incredibly strict, with very little variation allowed. Even so, many women continued to show individuality throughout their clothing, something that was important to the women at the time. In Australia, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay also began her long Army Nurses Corps career in nursing administration. From Australia, McKay's work in uniform distribution and administration brought her to New Guinea, a combat area, where she continued to rise in rank as she had throughout her service thus far. After New Guinea, she was sent back into the Philippines to work in Leyte. Shortly after the Leyte combat landings and combat operations, circumstances left an overwhelming need for nurses and doctors. Once again, in the jungles of the Philippines, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay found herself treating patients and staving off increasingly difficult environmental conditions at the 133rd General Hospital. Leyte was almost a reprise of Bataan, albeit with a greater amount of reinforcements and training. Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay and her fellow nurses at the time were still challenged in the increasingly difficult circumstances. The nurses cared for both American service members and Japanese prisoners of war through the many wards and 3,300 beds that they had built on site in response to the seemingly infinite amount of casualties arriving daily. There in Leyte, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay and the other nurses also took into their care a group of 72 liberated nurses who had previously been prisoners of war in the Santo Tomas internment camp located in Manila. The liberated nurses were in rough shape when they arrived at the 133rd General Hospital on Leyte. Their clothes were torn and shredded. They were starving and thin. Upon arrival, the nurses working in the hospital left the liberated nurses gifts by their bedside tables. No one had much, but the hospital's nurses gave nylon bras, lipsticks, hairpins, and anything else they could find to the newly liberated nurses. These acts of sympathy were common throughout the war. When the liberated nurses arrived back to the States, they were welcomed home with brand new clothing. After the war ended, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay tended to those in Leyte before eventually returning home. While Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay suffered greatly throughout her service, enduring bombings, starvation, heat, and tragedy, she also found friends and beautiful experiences. McKay said this in Jungle Angel, Bataan Remembered.
The art of nursing, I thought, is far more than medicine. It is a few words of encouragement, the squeeze of a hand, a refreshing bed bath, and a kind glance. During those horrible hours of jungle warfare, we attempted to put aside self and self-pity and substitute love for our fellow man. And in reply, a whispered thank you from a very sick soldier or a grateful look from the eyes of one dying was all the appreciation and love we nurses ever wanted.
After coming home from her time in World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay continued to serve in Army nursing. She returned to school in order to gain a master's in nursing education and went on as a leader in the Army's nursing services. After retirement, Hortense McKay continued to serve with compassion throughout her community. She devoted her life to helping others and continued that legacy even as her life came to a close on January 15, 1988. To the sound of ringing carillon church bells, winter bird songs, and the soft words of a poem, Lieutenant Colonel Hortense McKay, a lady, a citizen, a nurse, and a friend, was laid to rest, and her legacy of love and care arose like an angel into our hearts.